Good evening. My name is Nestor Matthews. I'm a psychology professor here at Denison University, and I'm happy to welcome you to Blowing Off Steam. STEAM is an acronym for science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics. Blowing Off Steam is a collaboration among three educational institutions: the Granville Public Library, The Ohio State University at Newark, and Denison University. My co-organizers on the Blowing Off Steam series are Lucy Chin Parker from the Granville Public Library, and Lucy is with us tonight. Welcome, Lucy. And Professor Mike Stamatikos from the Department of Physics at OSU Newark. Mike was not able to join us tonight, but we appreciate his contributions to our series. Tonight, we are coming to you on March 14th, which is Pi Day. Indeed, today is the 35th anniversary of Pi Day, which started on March 14, 1988 at the San Francisco Exploratorium. And now for tonight's main event. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter, Dr. Rebecca Walker-Reczek. Dr. Walker-Reczek is the Berry Chair of New Technologies in Marketing and Professor of Marketing at the Fisher College of Business at the Ohio State University. She received her PhD in marketing from the University of Texas at Austin. Her research focuses on consumer behavior, and she is a recipient of the prestigious Fisher Pacesetters Faculty Research Award. She has taught in all of Fisher's academic programs, including the undergraduate program, the MBA program, and the PhD program. Tonight's presentation, as you can see before you, is titled "Get Your Science Out of Here: When Does Invoking Science in the Marketing of Consumer Products Backfire?" Dr. Walker-Reczek, welcome and happy Pi Day to you.
Thank you. Happy Pi Day to you too. So I am very happy to be here to share my research with all of you. So thank you for joining us. And I'm going to be talking about a project that was actually inspired by a news event that happened about 10 years ago. So I'm going to tell you about that. And it was actually inspired by Chobani yogurt. And Chobani yogurt had a campaign called How Matters. And during this campaign, they put various messages on the underside of the foil lid that goes over the top of their yogurts. And they said, "Nature got us to 100 calories, not scientists," in one of these messages, #HowMatters. And this is one that got them into a little bit of PR trouble because some scientists saw this, posted it to social media, and basically said, "Hey, hang on a second. There's actually a lot of science involved in the making of consumer packaged goods like yogurt." And this got picked up in the news media, and there was a lot of discussion about why Chobani had done this. And I'm a marketing professor, and I'm trained as a consumer psychologist. And it got me thinking about what is it about consumer psychology that made Chobani as a brand think, hey, we should really distance ourselves from science. And you're going to hear from my husband, who is a chemistry professor at Denison, later tonight. And it got him thinking about, why do people not like science? And so the project I'm going to share with you tonight is really, is going to speak to both of those questions. So if we think about marketing and science, marketers are increasingly using science in how they talk about their products. So the use of scientific evidence in marketing has gone up dramatically over the last 50 years. And some of you may be familiar with the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. It requires, quote, "competent and reasonable scientific evidence behind any specific scientific claim for a product." And my favorite example of needing this is Reebok a few years back had a shoe called the Easy Tone shoe, and they promised that the shoe was going to deliver these specific targeted improvements in muscle. So for example, it's going to give you 28% more toned gluteus maximus, which is, of course, your behind, right? And the problem with this claim is they did not have competent and reasonable scientific evidence for this at all. And as a result, they ended up having to pay a very large fine to the FTC for making this false claim. So in this research, I'm not looking at the idea of specific scientific claims. Instead, what I'm looking at is something more like this. And this is a still from a TV commercial for Turtle Wax. And you can see in this commercial, we have actors portraying scientists showing the product as being made in a lab developed by scientists. And just another example of marketers using science to promote their product. You can see this is for Brain Freeze, a nitrogen ice cream store, basically, where they use liquid nitrogen to make the ice cream. And you can see the claim is science never tasted so good. So they're promoting that the ice cream is made with science. And you might think, okay, as a marketer, this is a good idea because there's lots of opinion surveys out there showing things like this. What this is a Pew Research Center survey showing the percent of adults in each group who say science has had a blank effect on society. And what this result is showing is that 73% of US adults say science has had a mostly positive effect on society. So you might think, okay, great. I'm going to promote all of my products as being made by science. But we also know that consumers sometimes avoid science in products. So, for example, people sometimes are opposed to GMOs, genetically modified organisms in food, and people have even been shown to have moral opposition to this. And we all saw in the news around the vaccine, a product developed by science and scientists, we saw a lot of pushback on the vaccine itself. So in this project, I'm going to be answering the question, when are science appeals for products beneficial versus when do they backfire? And to answer that question, I need to think about the difference between scientific theories and lay theories. So here you can see Joe, who you're going to hear from later, in his lab as a chemist, thinking about scientific theories. And scientific theories are theories used by scientists to explain the natural world. And I'm going to contrast those with lay theories. Lay theories are used by everyday people to understand and respond to all aspects of their world. And I told you I'm trained as a consumer psychologist. I draw a lot on theory from social psychology. And in social psychology, they study lay theories, thinking about people's understanding of the self and their social world. And a big difference between scientific theories and lay theories is that unlike scientific theories, where the goal is to actually uncover the objective truth about the world, lay theories don't have to be objective, testable, true. Sometimes we hear them in proverbs. So, for example, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. That's a common proverb we hear. That's actually basically saying the entity theory of the self from social psychology, the idea that people are fixed entities that can't change. And then the opposite of that, of course, is the incremental theory of the self, that it's never too late to turn over a new leaf, that people are actually malleable and can change. So I am not a social psychologist, so I'm not necessarily studying lay theories about the self and people's social world. I'm a consumer psychologist. So I want to understand how lay theories help people understand the marketplace. And when we're talking about lay theories in the marketplace, it often takes the form of people's beliefs about relationships between attributes. So for example, a lot of us hold the lay theory that high price equals high quality. So if you're shopping and like me, you don't know a lot about wine, you see a whole bunch of wines on the shelf, you might look at the price as a cue to try to infer quality. Even though, of course, it's not always true, right, that a higher priced wine is higher quality. We often see things like this where, Wine Spectator is showing 15 wines that are not terribly expensive, that are actually really good. So lay theories don't have to always be objectively true. And a lot of my research has looked at things like people's beliefs that unhealthy food is tastier, that healthy food is more expensive, that sustainable products aren't as strong and effective. So things that aren't necessarily true, but still shape how people make decisions in the marketplace. But in this project, I'm really interested in people's lay theories about the scientific process in the marketplace. So what I mean about that are people's beliefs about the method and analysis style that scientists are using to create products that end up on the shelf in your stores where you're shopping for them. And we turn to social psychology to think about what those lay theories might be. And there's something in social psychology called the stereotype content model that says people's beliefs about entities, other people, tend to fall on these two dimensions. They think of people as falling somewhere on this competent to incompetent dimension and somewhere on this warm to cold dimension. And I'm going to tell you that the stereotypes people have about scientists is that they are highly skilled, intelligent, and efficient. So they're very far on the competence end, but they are more on the cold end. They're aloof and unfriendly rather than kind and generous. So for all the scientists in the audience, I know you don't like to hear that, but remember, a stereotype is also not something that is true. It's a belief. It doesn't have to be true. And there's lots of research that shows that scientists are often perceived as high in agency, able to act, high in competence, but low in kind of connecting to others and warmth. But here's Joe again, defying the stereotype, working with one of his former students in the lab. But we know that people have this stereotype. This is some more data from the Pew Research Survey showing that compared to, say, medical doctors, medical researchers are seen as caring a lot less about people's interests, or nutrition researchers seen as caring a lot less about people's interests compared to dietitians. So in general, scientists are seen as not warm. And we thought maybe the same trade associations also apply to the scientific process itself. because there is some research in marketing showing that people stereotype firms along these same dimensions. We tend to think of for-profit firms as really competent, but nonprofits as really warm. So the first data that we collected was actually a pilot study where we just went out and we asked people in an online survey panel to tell us what their beliefs were about the scientific process on these two dimensions. So I'll show you what we asked people. We basically described what the scientific process in the marketplace was, and we asked them to rate the scientific process on these two dimensions. So this -4 cold all the way up to +4 warm for the warmth coldness dimension, and then this incompetent at -4 to competent at 4 for the competence dimension. And we just wanted to see what were the mean ratings there. How do people perceive the scientific process? And these are the results, and it just is numbers, but basically this 3 on this -4 to +4 scale says it's seen as highly competent. But this negative number here on the warmth scale means it's seen as relatively cold. So the way I like to summarize these results is this picture. This is basically how people see science. It's really competent, right? And it's really efficient, but it's cold, it's sterile, there's no warmth, there's no humanity. And this is really the lay theory about how people see the scientific process. So our central prediction, and I'm going to share a bunch of experiments with you that we ran. Our central prediction was that this lay belief that science is cold but competent creates expectations that can either match or mismatch with products. And it depends on the type of product we're talking about. And in marketing, we talk about products as either hedonic or utilitarian. And hedonic products are products that are all about feeling good. So it could be a product that's all about good taste, or it could be a body wash that's all about a really luxurious lather, or a candle that has a wonderful scent. It's really about your senses and feelings. It's not so much about the function, whereas utilitarian products are much more about the function. So things like these tools. And you could think of the same product, like a body wash could be a hedonic product that's all about a luxurious lather and a great scent, or it could be a utilitarian product that's all about killing odor-causing bacteria. And so what we're going to suggest is that whether science works well in promoting a product depends on if you're trying to promote hedonic or utilitarian attributes of that product. Because there's lots of research showing that hedonic products are perceived as warm and utilitarian products are perceived as competent. And there's even research showing that groups like nations that are stereotyped as being warmer are actually seen as making better hedonic products. So what all this means is that science appeal should be seen as less compatible when a product is all about, taste and comfort and sensory things, and it should be more compatible when the product is about utilitarian appeals, that it's about, functionality and working really well. And so I'm going to show you my hypotheses as they're written up in our paper, but basically what this says, when a product is positioned as hedonic, if you say it's made with science, that's going to backfire because of that mismatch. When we think about science, we think about science as cold and competent and sort of the opposite of warm, sensory, good taste, enjoyment. But if you position a product as utilitarian and saying it's all about competence and functionality, then pairing it with science is actually going to increase product valuation, because when we want something to work well, we have no problem with science because science is all about competence. And so, yeah, that's great if it's a utilitarian product. And then this is basically saying we think it's going to be driven by something called conceptual fluency, which is another way of saying it matches our expectations or not. So science just doesn't match with our expectations for hedonic products. Because hedonic products are supposed to be warm and science is cold. So it creates a mismatch that makes us like the product less when we pair science with a hedonic product. So I'm going to show you some studies that show that science appeals do backfire for hedonic products. And when I say studies, I often run studies in my lab at Ohio State. And my lab doesn't look like a chemistry lab. My lab is actually where we invite undergraduate participants to come in and participate in studies and tell us what they would do, either choosing real products or choosing hypothetical products. So I'll tell you about some that were conducted in our lab. So in this study, people were making a real choice. All the students who came in to be in the study got an actual cookie to eat. So we're dealing with a hedonic product that's all about taste, right? Chocolate chip cookies are about enjoyable taste. And we told the participants in the lab that they were going to help pick which new chocolate chip cookie was going to be featured in the cafe at the business school. And I feel like I have to tell you, this is not actually our cafe at the business school. It's not that pretty and fancy. This is just a picture that I thought looked good. It's not nearly as nice, but the participants thought they were making a real choice that was going to affect what was going to be in their cafe. And so we showed them a menu with 3 cookie options. And they had 3 choices to choose from, but there were 2 different conditions. So I'm going to show you what half participants saw. So this is what half the people saw. And it basically says, which cookie do you want to try? Circle the one you want, and then we would actually give it to them. And option A is where we're going to change it across conditions. So option A says luscious chocolatey taste. Option B and C, we've got these other cookie descriptions. But what we did is half the participants saw this menu, and the other half saw this menu. And if you look, it's a subtle change in some ways, but option A now says scientifically developed to have a luscious chocolatey taste. And our hypothesis was people would be less likely to choose option A when they thought that luscious chocolatey taste came from science. So let me show you the results. So this is showing you the cookie choice. This is the percent of people that chose option A in the control condition. Control here means there's no science. We just said it's luscious chocolatey taste. And about a third chose option A. But then in the science description, you can see that the percentage choosing option A significantly decreases. So what this tells us is even for a real choice of products, if they think that that luscious chocolatey taste came from science, they are less interested in having that cookie. So that was our first demonstration of the effect with a real choice. I'm going to show you another demonstration of the effect with a different product category. This is going to be with a really indulgent smoothie, like a smoothie designed to taste really good. And so here we once again gave people a science slogan or a control slogan. And in the control slogan, we said this fictitious brand of smoothies, we ensure that our smoothies taste delicious, indulgent, and creamy, so positioned as very hedonic. Versus in the science slogan condition, we said our rigorous scientific development process ensures that our smoothies taste delicious, indulgent, and creamy. And we measured people's purchase intentions here instead of choice, but how likely would you be to buy this smoothie based on what you just saw? And then we also measured various processes that might be driving it. So I told you, we think it's this conceptual fluency that's driving the effect, but we also measured a bunch of other things that we ruled out so that we can say, yeah, it really is fluency that's driving it. So let me show you the results. And these are the fluency measures. I'll show you those really quick. Basically, this is capturing that idea of a lack of fit. So our hypothesis is that people just don't think science fits for a hedonic product. So what we expect to see is people are going to say, yeah, the slogan doesn't fit well, it doesn't flow well, and it's not a good match when we see science paired with this hedonic smoothie. And that is what we found. So I'll show you the results for purchase intentions. You can see in the control condition when there's no science, that's the purchase intention number. And it's significantly lower when there's a science appeal. And it was driven by this sense that the slogan just doesn't match. It's just not right when taste was developed using science. So far, I've shown you the results with taste for chocolate chip cookies and taste for smoothies, but this is not an effect that only occurs for food. So I'm going to get out of the food domain to show you some other experiments that we ran. I've also only shown you hedonic products so far. I haven't showed you that science doesn't always backfire. It can actually be good. It can be good for a utilitarian product. So that's what I'm going to show you in the next study. And in this study, we switched domains to a body wash. And body wash is really nice as a product for my purposes because you can describe either hedonic or utilitarian attributes. And we actually went to walmart.com and read a whole bunch of descriptions of body washes to come up with the stimuli for this study. So I'm an expert now on how body washes are described. So let me show you what the conditions look like in this study. So the utilitarian attribute is will wash away odor-causing bacteria. Our effective lather will wash away odor-causing bacteria. This is the control slogan with no science. Then we add science and we say our effective lather is scientifically engineered to wash away odor-causing bacteria. So there's 4 conditions in this study. You've just seen 2, the utilitarian attribute with and without science, but we also have the hedonic attribute. Our creamy lather will immerse your senses in an indulgent experience. That's without science, that's the control. Then we add science. Our creamy lather is scientifically engineered to immerse your senses in an indulgent experience. When you read that, if that just sounds a little weird to you, that's actually our mechanism right there. That's what we're saying happens, that when consumers see science paired with immersing your senses in an indulgent experience, they just kind of go, ugh, that doesn't feel right. That doesn't seem right. And that's actually what's driving the reduced purchase intentions we see in the hedonic condition. So let me show you the results. You can see here that purchase intentions, this looks very much like what you saw with the cookies and the smoothies. People like it better when it's a hedonic, immerse your senses. The control, people are more likely to buy it relative to the science appeal. So the control is in orange and the science appeal is in blue. But this is the immerse your senses lather. We haven't looked at the lather that's washing away body odor yet. This is the lather that's washing away body odor. And you see the result actually totally flips. Now they like the science slogan better than the control. So if what you're trying to do has nothing to do with hedonic attributes and senses, but is something really functional, like, hey, get rid of body odor, then we're actually not only fine with science, we actually like science more because we want the competence associated with science. And we found that once again, that was mediated by fluency, so caused by fluency and not caused by various other mechanisms that we were able to measure and rule out. Okay, so I've given you lots of evidence so far that science can backfire for hedonic products, but I don't want you to get the impression that it always backfires for hedonic products. So there are some boundary conditions to the effect. And one is when science is actually consistent with your expectations. So there are some product categories where science is naturally salient. And so people are already thinking about science, it's already fluent. And so it doesn't produce that same backfire effect. And I'll talk about that in just a second. And the other is we're going to argue that not everybody sees science as cold. So I'm not going to see the same backfire effect for people who actually trust science or see science as warm. So let me go back to product category as a boundary condition. So in some product categories, science is naturally not very salient. It's not very fluent. And that's where we think we're going to see the effect. So we actually did another pilot study to find out where are the product categories where people naturally think about science. And we asked people to rate the extent to which science development is top of mind for these different products. So we looked at consumer packaged goods, like what you've seen so far, like foods, beverages, personal care products. Then we look at non-consumer packaged goods, like electronics, motor vehicles, prescription drugs. And what we found is that science is actually naturally pretty salient for things like prescription drugs, motor vehicles, electronics. We're not shocked to hear that there's STEM involved in making our prescription drugs or our cars or our electronics. Where we don't expect science, though, is the categories where I've been showing you the effects so far, like foods, beverages, personal care products. That's why Chobani in that opening example felt okay distancing itself from science because they're yogurt. People are not naturally thinking about science being involved. So our hypothesis was we wouldn't expect a backfire effect necessarily for prescription drugs or motor vehicles or electronics if these are promoted with science, barring something that's politicized like the COVID vaccine, other types of prescription drugs. We wouldn't expect that science backfire effect. So we thought, can we use that to overcome the backfire effect for things like food? So our next hypothesis was if we can convince people that the science actually is necessary for creating the product, will that backfire effect not occur? So we tested this in the context of cookies because baking is a really interesting one. As a category, we think about baking as being all about, taste and comfort and home cooking and maybe grandma's cookie recipe. But the reality is there's a lot of chemistry involved in baking. There's a number of reactions happening. There's a lot of science behind baking that people aren't necessarily thinking about. So we thought if we can make that science salient and people expect the science, then a science slogan won't feel disfluent and we won't see that same backfire effect. So that's what we tested in our next study. So we wanted to see, will scientific fields backfire for hedonic products like cookies when we first make salient to consumers? And salient just means make people aware, make it top of mind for them that science is necessary for creating that particular product. So in this study, before people saw the cookies and saw a science slogan or not a science slogan, we said, hey, we want you to first evaluate an article that a cookie brand is thinking about posting on their website. And we ran it in the summer. And the article is all about the importance of knowing what's in season for baking. And so this is a control article. It says nothing about science. And we see our chef out on the beach in the summer sun. So half the people read this article. And then the other half of participants read this article. And here, now we have our chef in a chemistry lab. And this article was all about the amount of chemistry that's involved in baking and why it's important to understand chemistry when you are baking. So people either in this control condition, science was not made salient, or they saw the chef in the chemistry lab and science was made salient. And then they saw a cookie slogan, very similar to what I showed you before, that the delicious chocolate taste was either developed by science or they saw no mention of science when promoting this delicious chocolate taste. And here are the results. This is the control condition when science was not made salient first. And here you see what I've been showing you for hedonic products across these studies, that people are more likely to say they'll buy the cookie when there's no science involved, right? It's that backfire effect for science when we don't first make the necessity of science salient. But then let me show you what happens when we do make science salient by showing the chef in the chemistry lab. There we see there's now no difference between the science appeal and the control appeal. So it's not that they like science more than the control appeal, because we're still not talking about competence. So it's not that science has an advantage here. It's just that they're no longer turned off by science. Once they understand that science is involved, it's just about expectations. Once they have that expectation, they don't have that same negative response to science as you saw in my other studies. So that's one boundary condition. If you can make salient to consumers, make them understand that science is involved in the production of products where they don't expect science, then it's not that people hate science. They just don't necessarily respond positively when they're not expecting it and don't understand why it's there. So that I thought was a very interesting study. But we also wanted to look at who doesn't exhibit the science backfire effect. So I showed you some protests of people that were against various aspects of science, but we've also seen things like the March for Science of people who are supporting science. And our theory says that if people see science as warm instead of cold, then there shouldn't be a backfire effect. Because if science isn't cold, then there's no mismatch between a science appeal and a hedonic product, or put another way, there's no disfluency. And trust is something that's highly associated with warmth. So we predicted people who trust scientists are unlikely to see them as cold. So we wouldn't expect them to show the backfire effect. And then we also thought, you know who else is not going to show this backfire effect? And this was very much inspired by talking to my husband about this project, who as a scientist kept saying, I would never think that. I would never not like a product because of a science appeal. And I thought, that's actually entirely consistent with my theory, because he doesn't have a stereotype of scientists as cold and aloof. So I thought maybe scientists and those who work closely with them won't show the backfire effect. So for some of these studies, we're now actually getting out of the lab and running these studies with online samples where we're surveying adults who vary on the extent to which they trust scientists. And we're also going to survey adults who vary in whether or not they work in a STEM field. So let me show you the first study. Does seeing scientists as trustworthy, does that reduce this backfire effect? So for this study, we once again used body wash. The control slogan, a little bit simplified, is just an indulgent lather, versus the science slogan was scientifically engineered for an indulgent lather. And we asked people their purchase intentions. So just rate how likely you would be to buy it on kind of a 1 to 7 scale. And then we measured trust in scientists. And we actually took our measures from the Pew Research Center. So we asked, to what extent would you say you have confidence in scientists to act in the best interest of the public? How often would you say that scientists provide fair and accurate information? And how often would you say that scientists are transparent about conflicts of interest? Let me show you the results. So this graph is a little bit hard to interpret. So let me walk through it for you. What this is saying is on the x-axis, this is trust in scientists. And so higher numbers indicate higher trust. And then on the main part of the graph, the solid black line is the control condition, and the dotted line underneath is the science condition. And that 7 number for basically people who trust scientists on a 1 to 9 scale from 7 and up, they don't show a difference in how they respond to the control condition versus the science appeal. They like them equally well if you trust scientists on a 7 and up on this 1 to 9 scale. But if you don't trust scientists as much, so if you don't have really high trust in scientists, you show a difference between the control appeal and the science appeal. You're more likely to purchase with the control rather than the science appeal. And that difference gets bigger the less you trust scientists. And just to give you an idea of what percentage of people fall, so this shaded region is where we see a significant difference between the control condition and the science condition. Almost 70% of our sample is in that shaded region. It's about 30% of people who are in that high trust category who don't show that difference between the control condition and the science condition, just to give you some kind of background information on what this looks like in the sample. So that shows us that, people who trust scientists, see scientists as warm and trustworthy, don't show the backfire effect. I'm going to tell you about one more study, and then I'll kind of summarize where we are. In my last study, we actually got 2 different samples. We got a sample of adults that work in STEM fields versus adults that work in non-STEM fields. And STEM is an acronym like Nestor was mentioning. So here it was science, technology, engineering, and math. And I'm going to show you the results for the non-STEM sample. We use body wash again here. And we see in the non-STEM sample, people are more likely to buy the product with the control appeal relative to the science appeal. So the science appeal is blue. So once again, they don't like the science appeal because it was this really hedonic body wash. But in the STEM sample, so this is the STEM sample, we actually see no difference between the science appeal and the control condition. So we don't see a backfire effect for science appeals for not just scientists, because I want to add that the STEM sample was not just scientists, it was also people that work with scientists. And I find that really interesting as well, because it's not just scientists that don't have the stereotype about scientists, it's people that work closely with them and see scientists as people and recognize that they're not, cold, mechanistic, non-human, right? They're real people and they see them as real people. So I thought that was a very interesting finding as well. So just to kind of summarize what I've talked about, for products that are positioned as hedonic, science appeals backfire for consumer packaged goods. But when a product is positioned as more utilitarian, science appeals actually result in greater purchase intentions. When we make the necessity of science salient for production, we don't get that backfire effect for hedonic products. And when your target market that we talk about in marketing, the person you're trying to reach with the product, if they trust scientists or view scientists as warm, we don't get the backfire effect. So that's the summary of the findings that I've presented. But I think they have broader implications. So if you think about messages like these, connecting getting vaccinated with this really hedonic, warm love appeal, or talking about global warming in terms of, saving polar bears, and not talking about, the utilitarian consequences of what happens as the planet warms. It makes me be about, really, I want to protect the polar bears. That hedonic type of appeal may only be working for the 30% of people who have really high trust in science and are okay with seeing hedonic messaging paired with science. And we may be losing that 70% of my sample who does not have high trust in science and feels uncomfortable with hedonic paired with scientific messaging. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I really appreciate it. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen so we can all see each other.
Rebecca, thank you. Thank you very much for that. Such interesting work. We've got so many comments to make, but before I do, I want to bring on you've already kind of introduced one of our discussants tonight. So Dr. Joe Reczek is with us tonight. He's professor of chemistry and biochemistry here at Denison University, where students simply know him as Dr. Joe. And Dr. Joe is a science enthusiast and a very much dedicated to the public education of science. So Joe, thank you for joining us, and happy Pi Day to you also.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm very happy to be here, especially following such fascinating work. And I don't know if we want to just pause for a minute now and see if any of the audience has questions, or maybe just for Rebecca on what she's talked about. And then we can maybe get into some ideas about, as she ended up, what are the broader implications here? And, how can scientists and those who want to use science for productive good be more effective in their messaging and bringing people along? But please, any questions?
Yeah, let's open up for questions. So let's invite our audience to feel free to unmute and ask a question. If you'd rather not unmute for any reason and you'd like to type your question into the chat, I'm happy to read it for our audience, and we can take a chance at answering that. So please feel free to use the chat to ask your question or to make your comment, or feel free to unmute, whichever is most comfortable for you.
Yeah, I see an interesting question in the chat. What about appealing to both for marketing purposes? So if the question is appealing like a body wash, if you're talking about both a utilitarian and a hedonic attribute in the same message, I think that can be very effective, but only if you're pairing the science specifically with the utilitarian attribute. And we had a study like that I didn't share. And we found that it's totally fine to talk about both types of attributes as long as the science is specifically focused only on the utilitarian one. So that was a really good question, because we actually did run that study.
Nestor, I have a question, and it's more for just to help to bring me up to date, which I had worked in science. You talked about using the online, the Turkers.
Mm-hmm.
That is just was beginning to start about the time I was finishing some of the research that we were doing. It sounds as though it's become much more of a common way of addressing getting survey information back from individuals rather than the old-fashioned way. Was there ever a discussion in terms of the confidence in using that type of method to reinforce what you're doing?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that it's become much more common. It's a service called Amazon MTurk, and it's people that are participating in research surveys for a small amount of payment. And what we generally do is we try to triangulate for generalizability. We run studies with both undergraduate students and we run them online with MTurkers. And that last study that I shared with you was actually on a relatively new platform called Prolific. And Prolific will give you representative samples and also give you pre-screened samples. So that's how we were able to get a sample of STEM workers and non-STEM workers. So I think generally the best practices at this point is for generalizability to show that the same effect replicates across different samples. So in this paper, we had 3 different samples. But yeah, it's a really good question. And if you had stopped working in this area, you might not be familiar with Prolific, but I really like Prolific for the ability to get a nationally representative sample, which you can't do on MTurk.
Right. With MTurk just starting at the time, that was certainly one of the downfalls of it. And it sounds like, I'm not familiar with Prolific, but it sounds like it's a step above the next generation in terms of being more effective and reliable.
Also more expensive as a result. So that's its downfall.
Thank you.
Something else about Prolific. I know the Prolific actually the platform encourages what psychologists would often call attention checks, because if you're on MTurk, you can ask any number of questions and people can just respond randomly. And so what researchers will sometimes do is insert some questions that have factually correct answers. And so we have some idea about whether the participant is just responding randomly or whether they're actually reading and understanding the question. And Prolific encourages the researchers to use something like that. So lots of good things happening over at Prolific. I'm also grateful to MTurk for getting that ball game rolling.
Yes.
Maybe Prolific has taken it to the next level, but MTurk got it rolling. So, and really nice to have the triangulation and to see it replicate. And along those lines, I wanted to thank you. I'll try not to get into the weeds on methodology. The students who will be watching this know that I am a Psych 200 professor, and that means that I talk about research methods and I talk about statistics. Delightful to hear about replication. And thank you for putting your pre-registered badge on several of those. So our students will know about the importance of pre-registering your hypotheses, which you shared with us ahead of time. So thank you for that. Great stuff.
Yeah, it's been a leap in development, and I'm coming from a science side in terms of how sometimes people viewed at the time in social science. It was always the question of how do you know, how can you be sure? And some of my colleagues were much more adamant on that than the other colleagues that I worked with. So I'm glad to see we've come to another generation, I think, move forward.
Lots of developments in that space in the last 10 years with things like pre-registration. Yes, we're borrowing methods from social psychology for sure.
Great, Constance, great question. I wonder if I might ask Rebecca or anyone else who'd like to chime in on what we might think of as a boundary condition, maybe as another mediator. So I just love that you had body wash, which could go either way, right? It could be hedonic, it could be utilitarian, really, really clever. And then you can talk about different kinds of products that land on either side of that divide. You can talk about who the audience is and whether they're STEM friendly or STEM practitioners and so forth. I wonder too if there might be some kind of a context effect. So we're not too far past the US Super Bowl. It was a couple of weekends ago. I'm not a regular sports watcher, but I do know that even people who don't watch sports a lot will usually watch Super Bowl because there's a lot of hedonic value. And I'm wondering if there's ever a moment in a Super Bowl 3-hour interval, lots of commercials there, where any of the science would fly. It might just be that the context is so genuinely hedonic that maybe we should just not even try a scientific sell there because it's just not the right framing.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We never explored anything like that, but it makes me think about not just temporal context effects like the Super Bowl, but also location-specific context effects. It makes me think of Las Vegas, right? That people when they're in Vegas, they're focused on hedonism. So that also may not be the appropriate place for a lot of science-focused appeals. That's a really interesting question. You could test that and see, even across different cities, that would be a very interesting thing to test.
On a smaller scale, it would be listening to your question, Nestor, in terms of as you're teaching science and having a better understanding of where students are coming from and relations in terms of some of what we're seeing these days in terms of what you would say the anti-science movement and stripping everything that has any history or reliability out of schools and burning books. So there are implications there in terms of how science can move forward in an honest and understandable way that can have an appeal that I guess in some ways may address the hedonic, but obviously the utilitarian importance of that. So having been in the education field for a while in the sciences, how do you approach, particularly you're dealing with students who come by the time they come to college, have been indoctrinated in a certain sense in terms of where their major ideas are lying and how they respond to something that is not hedonic.
And I think that our study showing that when you make it salient to people that there is science involved in baking cookies, I think what that shows is the potential power of scientific education to get people to be more accepting of science. I'm actually going to defer to Joe on that because he does a lot more science outreach than I do. So yeah, Joe, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and well, and I think a really, really important one, and honestly is a large part of the motivation for I think me kind of asking very, very politely for Rebecca to be here tonight with this fascinating work. And I think she's being modest in the amount of patience she's had to have throughout this process, but from me basically railing against reality here, like, no, it can't be true. How could they do that? The science is in everything, And so two big things that I latch onto there. One, and this is a bit subtle, but when you talk about promoting science and particularly getting students in your class, and we as the scientists don't know about this lay theory that 70% of our population has, right? And so for me as an educator, I'm blinded to the fact, because I trust science, I know science, and I don't have this backlash effect. So when I'm trying to appeal to what I think are kind of emotional, pro-social, hedonic associations of quality of life with my students, before this work, I was unaware that I was probably being counterproductive in many cases, right? And I think that's exactly your point, that now that we're aware, and not only that, we can turn that around. And so two things I think is, we know that science education isn't enough because in my experience, you don't get past that, well, we don't trust you because science is cold and you don't believe in it the same way I do, right? And so what I try and do in my classroom is actually try and build that relationship and focus on, I am a person, I am a scientist, but I love and enjoy life and care for others and try and do the opposite. And so, when Nestor, you suggested what had happened in the Super Bowl, this is a hedonic experience, maybe science could never be good in that context. The first thing I thought is the National Academy of Sciences have to take out an ad in which the only point of the ad is showing scientists as warm and human and collaborative. Oh my gosh, we have to do that, right? Because I feel like that's a way to tackle this, is to basically start to reverse that lay theory. And then science can be more productive because there's so much science, and this used to drive me nuts. There's so much science in that yogurt. There's so much science in the scent. There's so much, I'm an organic chemist. I make some of these molecules. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. Anyway, I went off, but does that make sense? And does that kind of get at the vein there? And I'm wondering what you guys think, how could we turn this off for better pro-social science for good, messaging?
Speaking for someone who was involved with NGSS Academy standards from the outside, not not being on the panel. There were two things that came to mind. One of what you're saying in terms of certainly the group that put the NGSS together, the national, Next Generation Science, were focused on the specifics of the science. There's one individual, do you know Phil Bell from the University of Washington? He has moved to the point where he deals mostly with the diversity aspect of it, but he is touching on the social aspect of science for the everybody, but in particular the indigenous, the individuals, lower income, et cetera. He would be the closest one who might be able to relate more widely. But right now, the NGSS is going through a sort of re-examining what happened 10 years ago with where the NGSS is these days. And if you look at the science scores coming out internationally, we have plummeted. And if you're just teaching, what we see so much in the classroom is that they're just teaching the cold science. And what you're saying, Joe, about the importance of relationships is something that does not come across. And a lot of teachers who teach science, those who teach science most effectively are those that have that personal interaction with the students where they feel comfortable and trusting. Most high school teachers don't necessarily do that, and it's the demands of the education system that forces them into a box. But at some point, I would suggest you might want to touch base with Phil Bell. At the time, I would say he was the most forward-thinking in terms of relationships with STEM and how to teach STEM.
You guys are picking up on something that I'm actually exploring in a follow-up project to this one. And Constance, that idea of relationships is what we're focused on. Mm-hmm. We find that people's default assumption about scientists is that they're really independent and they don't work collaboratively. And they're just like about promoting their own ideas and their own careers. And really nothing could be further from the truth, because right. All labs are very collaborative. But we find that if we describe scientists as collaborative, people actually think of the scientist as more pro-social. They are more willing to share word of mouth about the scientist's findings. And they're also more willing to buy products created by that scientist. So things like sunscreens and vitamins, if they feel like the scientist worked in a communal way, because then they feel like the scientist is more pro-social, and therefore the products that they're making are going to do a better job at helping people. Yeah. But the default assumption is that the scientist is not communal and is not working collaboratively.
And while they're trying to create those collaborative environments in the classroom, it doesn't necessarily come across because it's awkward. There's not enough background for them to build on. So I think continuing to touch base and get to the point where they're teaching science, but maybe not expecting the whole canon of the NGSS to be digested by a student by the time they graduate from high school.
Well, I will look up, Phil Bell, but, I want to take that one step forward and say, if you can, appeal to, I'll say a student, but just a person's, sense of value, but personally and for society, they're often far more willing to engage in the scientific part of the science, Sure. And so I think that we're actually seeing a kind of cyclic effect here where the science scores drop, we double down on facts and science, and and I'll point out what I'm sure you all know, that for a large part of teaching introductory science is focused on the names of individuals, right, who have done the science, right, which is exactly how then we create this own lay theory, that it is those individuals in their lab, triumphantly figuring things out for themselves that drove science to where it is. And again, there's some pushback now in circles around, debunking essentially that myth, right, of the lone scientist with the eureka moment. But far and away, that's how we teach science. I mean, even my intro chemistry course, if you don't pay attention, you're just saying a bunch of names. And to get to your point on diversity, most of them are not very diverse names, throughout the past 200 years, and for very good reasons. And I don't know if Rebecca has any data or looked at this, but when we talk about diversity for very good reasons, oftentimes a lot of traditionally, underrepresented groups have even more reason to mistrust science and scientists. Mm-hmm. And so is this effect even more pronounced and those students that as a community, we are trying to more intentionally include.
Yes, yes. Well, and I also think I'll put a plug in for Denison. I think the faculty that you teach with is probably a generation ahead of a lot of faculty. I was at Ohio State, and it's hard to make changes in physics and chemistry in terms of how they were teaching the courses. Again, partly with the way the education system is driven and what's at the at a R1 institution when it comes to science. So it's good to hear that we're trying to make inroads. And by the way, I'm a Denison grad, so I'm proud of my institution.
And Constance, I'll share that I actually just presented this research to an interdisciplinary group of scientists at Ohio State on the Columbus campus, food chemists, biologists looking mostly at food, but I was happy to be able to share this research to try to make some more scientists aware of this lay theory.
Yeah. Have you been to physics?
No. Chemists and biologists only.
Okay, got to move to physics.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I will pick up on that though. One thing, Constance, you had said something earlier about, the social science, and I'm very familiar with kind of frankly, the lay theory of more natural scientists to believe that social science is nice and interesting, but doesn't really tell you anything concrete, right? And
right.
I will admit that, before getting involved with my current wife, I had a few more of those thoughts myself and I have learned since, one, to think of it differently, that social science and natural science are fundamentally different things, and that's okay. And you understand what you can understand about one, and you understand what you can understand about the other, and that's fantastic. But more so, when presenting things the way Rebecca does in terms of an experiment, right, that gives data that you can then put statistical power on, when I present some of this to my colleagues in physics around the idea of, hey, here are, freshman students, lay theories about your feeling of their, how they belong in your classroom or not, then they're looking at data and they have to challenge some of the assumptions they make. But I don't think, that mechanism hasn't, in my mind, or at least from what I know of, hasn't been broadly available to try and explain to scientists that most of the people they're trying to communicate with just don't feel the same way they do, and that is getting in their way.
Yeah.
And,
work to do.
I can pick up on one more related thread. Of course, I teach in psychology. I'm not a social psychologist myself, but I have colleagues who are, and they frequently talk about the contact hypothesis. That's a phrase that they use. And the idea is that our perception of people who are in our so-called outgroups, maybe we are not ourselves members of STEM, or maybe we're not even working in STEM fields, but maybe we have siblings who are, or we have neighbors who are, something along these lines. Simply having contact with members of the outgroup often changes for the better our attitudes towards the outgroup. And so I think I see that going on because it wasn't just STEM workers, right? It was people who had some contact with STEM workers, right? They're familiar with them. And we saw an improvement in that attitude there also. So the contact hypothesis, and I hadn't heard it applied in this particular way, but it seems like they're right there with yet another finding that supports that general principle from social psychology.
That is the theory that we use to explain that finding, that it's not just scientists, but anyone who works in a STEM field that doesn't show the backfire effect. But then the follow-up for that is that maybe there's an opportunity for an intervention, right? Where you have people meet a scientist and have real positive, and the contact hypothesis, my understanding is it works best when you work cooperatively with someone from an outgroup. So maybe not just meet a scientist, but some type of cooperative, collaborative experience with a scientist could go a long way to reducing these stereotypes about scientists. I'll leave it up to Joe to figure out how you actually implement that. Yeah, I agree, Nestor, that could be a very productive thing to do.
unfortunately, I don't think marriage will work for everybody. But I like to think that Rebecca has a slightly more positive lay theory about the warmth of scientists after almost 10 years, most of the time, right? But that's a great point. And so often too, when we look at these outreach events, this is, I love this blowing off steam because of its interactiveness. But, often when I do outreach, it's the scientist putting on demonstrations or leading, so it's very, very, never have I been in an environment where the scientist is there to collaboratively solve some other problem, right? And just be there as hey, I'm here and I think and I feel and I do like things like you do. And I just wonder, is there a way to get this into the kind of ethos of science communication?
Yeah, it sounds like a real good challenge for those of us who are in Sigma Xi. It's a scientific honor society for scientific research. And one of their goals is the public education of science. And one view of education is, here are the facts, let me tell them to you, right? But that might only go so far. And we can talk all we want about those, but really meeting the listener where they are, trying to understand their needs and understand what will work for them is very important. And I think the research that Rebecca has laid out tonight gives us a lot to think about along those lines. I'm looking at the clock and I see that we're just about out of time, and I realize people have other kinds of time commitments. We would have time for one more comment or one more question if there is one. So let's go to our audience or to our discussants, see if there's anything else before we run out of time people would like to get on the table.
One thing I will just throw out, there's been in some ways more progress made in the mathematic education field with regards to engaging students and creating more opportunities for collaboration than I was seeing in the sciences. So that some context in that respect might be of interest in terms of where to look where something may be happening already.
Excellent. Well, we'll always benefit from any help that we can get on this important work. So, okay, so I think we're just about out of time. Let me thank all the discussants. Very special thanks to Rebecca Walker-Reczek for putting together a fantastic presentation on sharing some really interesting research. And grateful again to the Granville Public Library for helping us get the word out here in blowing off steam. And we thank you all for joining us this evening, and happy Pi Day one last time to everybody.